that video was rad. I like the trend of covering vaguely 3D technological looking stuff in light fabric. I'm going to be talking about websites. Websites aren't my favorite thing. In the ever-changing face of front-end development specifically. So we're going to talk a whole bunch about and use the term front-end developer a whole bunch of times and how that's changed. And it's just something that I'm interested in. That's why we're going to talk about it, because I've spent, my medium-length career kind of self-identifying that way. I'm a front-end developer and trying to help other people get good at it as I learn about it too. So like I said, CSS Tricks, or like Jason said, CodePen, Shop Talk Show, sites of mine where they're my career and they're my way of helping us all get better at this world of front-end development. I'd like to just define it, even though I think all of us probably have a mental model that understands what front-end development is, probably okay, but I think what's interesting is that it hasn't changed. So as we're talking about a lot of stuff that has changed, maybe the core of it hasn't. And one thing that I think is important for all of us to understand is that it's a job that we get paid to do. It's a job title, which is a personal thing. To talk about this isn't just an academic exercise. It's one that matters to us because we're paid to do it, and that's sensitive to us, sensitive to me anyway. So that's cool, and I know that's true because I have a job board where I have people post jobs. I mean, it's self-scoped to front-end development jobs, but people use that word on all kinds of job boards. Anywhere that you'll see web jobs posted, they're hiring front-end developers, and they use the word front-end developer. So it's real. It's not a construct of our minds or anything. People are hired to do front-end development a lot. So cool. But what else is it? What is the job? What do you do? Mina Markham puts it this way.
It deals with things that you can see, things that are actually in front of you on the screen in a web client, And in my mind, anyone who works on a user-facing interface or application, website, whatever, in my mind, that's a front-end developer.
Heck yeah, it's the thing that's in front of you in a browser or whatever they are. So it's the browser, the thing that the browser's on, the device and all the shapes, and the person that uses that. It's kind of those three things. If that's what you care about, that's what you're hired to do, and that's what your day-to-day work is being a browser person, you're a front-end developer. So that's what kind of hasn't changed and probably won't. That's what the front part of front-end developer is that you're browsers, devices, and users kind of person. Which is different than if front-end developers exist, do back-end developers still exist? Yeah, they do too. So I'm not trying to redefine any of these terms necessarily. Here's a way to, because it's funny to be so front-end developers care about the users and nobody else does? Well, maybe.
I struggle to phrase it in a way that's doesn't sound a back-end person doesn't care about the user or doesn't care about websites, because they kind of do too, right?
But they're totally allowed not to, right? If you're the person who's writing the SQL code for the database, I think you're totally allowed not to care about the user. This is your personal choice, because at that point, you're delegating your responsibility. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's totally fine to not want to call yourself a front-end developer too.
Yeah. There's all kinds of jobs in this world, and it's okay that we split up a little bit in our responsibilities and what we care about. So I'm not trying to redefine that or make back-end developers feel like they're less important or anything, because that's totally not true. You're a front-end developer, you live in browser town, for sure, which is more complicated than it seems. Lots of browsers out there, lots of, you're always thinking about them too and dealing with inconsistencies and all that kind of stuff, not just in the browser engine itself, but in the size of them and what they support and on the zillions of billions of different devices out there. It's a hard job. Just that part of it is pretty hard. Wow. Okay, so it's a job, you get paid to do it, it deals with the browsers, the users and the devices those browsers are on, and so what is it? What's the tool set that you need to know? There's all kinds of stuff, but generally, because it's a browser job, it boils down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, those things. And even this part is interesting, because I happen to know plenty of developers who don't necessarily know all those things equally well, even though that's their job, that's the kind of the core foundation of their job. Lots of developers who have had long, successful careers at all kinds of different companies who really just don't write any JavaScript at all. Lots of people I've heard from that kind of feel that, even though JavaScript runs right alongside them as a native language, just like the other two. And I know lots of developers, especially these days, that kind of don't know CSS particularly well. I even work with some of them. They're great JavaScript people. That's where their mind's at and is focused. And they kind of, just like back-end developers, are kind of like outsourcing the responsibilities of dealing with users and things to somebody else. There's JavaScript developers who kind of outsource the responsibility of styling to other developers. This is kind of all natural and fine, But it's just interesting. This whole talk isn't going to be about that, but I kind of wrote an essay about that earlier this year called The Great Divide. That was like one of the feelings, like we're all front-end developers, right? We can all agree on that and go to the same conferences, perhaps. But there's kind of just a feeling like there's kind of like JavaScript people and not. And I don't suspect that this will last forever. It's just kind of a feeling that's happening right now that people are like on one side or the other of this thing in a way. Like I kind of hope that that's not the case forever, but it kind of feels like the case now. Now here's a Brad like kind of putting a point on maybe not necessarily that exact divide, but a divide like it.
I don't want to sort of configure Webpack or like gulp like workflows and stuff like that. And so I found that I'm sort of on the more design, the front of the front end, and then sort of having somebody else that's more on like the back of the front end as a nice sort of complementary role.
We don't have front end and back end anymore. It's just front of the front, back of the front. So it's all front. Which is funny. And Brad's saying like there is that divide that he feels because he's got enough on his plate, but he isn't saying like we're different breeds of people. He's saying what's valuable is when they work together and there can be complementary roles. There's some like Voltron stuff that happens, which is pretty rad. In the comments and people I've talked to and fallout from that Great Divide article, I learned that even big companies like Google think of it in that way, and they have different tracks for employees that focus on, in some sense, front of the front and back of the front kind of stuff. And they have different ladders and different expectations for advancement and that kind of thing. So that it's like manifesting in real personal ways for people too. And look, they even get paid the same, which is interesting, at least at Google. So I'm not trying to like tear down the word front-end developer. I still think it's a real and meaningful term. But this is what I mostly want to focus on, is that what's happening to the world of front-end development is that there's like more things being thrown on the stack of what we need to do, like responsibilities that have moved. So let's talk about that. One of the big ones that I almost don't think like is talked about enough, because I feel like the ship has already sailed in some way, is component-driven development, which is kind of a really positive thing that's happened over, the last half of decade or so. And there's unavoidable in the world of front-end development is like the suite of front-end JavaScript frameworks. Like I'm sure most people in this room know about them or work directly in them or whatever. There's a native version of it called Web Components, but probably much more popular than that, or any one of these is probably more popular than native Web Components, but all together represent a massive slice of what's going on in front-end development these days. And as much as they disagree on all kinds of stuff, they all agree on the idea of building things in components, which is kind of cool. It's front-end developers saying, like, please, for the love of God, give me some kind of abstraction. I like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's great. I want to write semantic HTML and good reusable CSS and think well about my JavaScript, but I want to be able to chunk it down. I want to be able to combine it in reusable parts that like make sense for the project I'm building on, and I can't blame anybody for that. It's kind of great. I want to build things that are like my thing, because that's how I think and that's how my company thinks, and I want my thing to be like in charge of the templating for itself, and it has a certain set of responsibilities that I'm giving it. It might bring its own design with it, and it might deal with its own data, but I want to think of it as like this chunk that I use. That's like component-driven design that's been such a big deal. So let's look at it in the context of CodePen, because I'm familiar with working on this site and watching its evolution over time. So there's like a page of CodePen. Let's zoom in and look at that. You could imagine that being a component and having those type of things happening, right? But let's start even smaller than that. Like, what could be a component on this card? Well, let's start about as small as it can get. That little heart icon down there, even that thing is a component in this case. Right now it's an icon, so of course it's being drawn on the page by SVG. So we could just use an SVG tag in our template or HTML markup. But in our case, it ends up that way, of course, because everything does, because it's a website. But in this case, we have an SVG icon component of our own make. And we do that for like developer ergonomics, because it's nice to have that thing. And what happens is that now I just say which icon I want, and it just gets drawn on the page as a heart. And all this other stuff is abstracted away, like making sure it has a sensical width and height and has all the semantically correct elements on it, and it gets displayed cross-browser in the best possible way. And so I've built that just so that we do things right. And if things need to change, I can make sweeping changes across the app that fix things to be done correctly with our icon system. Cool. So just that little thing is an icon system because it's nice for us to work in that way. What else is a component? Even just including the little tiny number next to it, that's a brand new component at CodePen because it has a different set of responsibilities. Not only is it an icon with a number next to it, so it has a little bit of CSS layout that's just unique to itself, but it has a new job, and that's displaying a number that comes from real data in the sky or whatever, and it has a click handler all to itself. That number 229, when you click on it, something's going to happen to it. And we'll come back to that in a minute, but architecturally it makes sense that that's a component all to itself. What else can be a component? Well, that whole row, that's a useful thing to be able to repeat and use in different areas of the site. And of course, this preview area and this header, you can imagine like architecturally us deciding that these make sense for us as building blocks of a front-end application. And then things get bigger. Components aren't just component here, component here, component here. They tend to be nested within each other architecturally to do what you want to do. So this whole thing is an item, super useful for us. Items can be of different types and different styles and laid out in different ways, but the responsibility there is this is an item. And of course, an item then sits within an item grid, which has different responsibilities. It needs to be laid out in a certain way, and it deals with pagination, for example. So we're kind of choosing what responsibilities and what design and what type of things happen on a site and building up architecturally from there. This isn't us saying like HTML isn't good enough for us. This is saying, no, we want to build, we're giving ourselves building blocks to work from. So this idea of components is absolutely baked into the idea of all JavaScript frameworks, and it's kind of been great. People love it. Front-end developers like working in that way. Designers are like, cool, thanks for catching up. We think in components already. Symbols and all that stuff that's been around forever, and other developers are like, yeah, cool, components, sounds like a good idea, congratulations, So it's just been it's good movement for everybody. But now let's like move up a level from there. What about like dealing with the site architecture itself, like almost down to the URL level of the entire application, which is often referred to as routing? Like, that's interesting. Definitely something I used to think of as a back-end concern has now started to occasionally make its way into entirely a front-end concern, which feels weird. Don't focus too much on that stuff. It's just screenshots of possibilities. So this is kind of where we left off with this item grid. What else could be a component while you're building this site? Do we just leave that stuff to be components? Well, maybe not, because everything has its own little responsibility layer that's interesting. The title could be a component. We could have icon button components and tabs, and everything can be a component. There's a sidebar component and search and the user menu, and all of a sudden the whole damn page is components. Great. There's a lot of power and usefulness there. And when you've done that, kind of the whole page becomes a component. And once you've done that, what you've really done is you've made that into a component, which is kind of interesting. So now it's like, okay, so URLs are mine now? Like I can choose to render certain components based on that URL. Now that's kind of become what used to be a back-end concern, and it's now a front-end concern. And it's really made me the architect of the whole damn joint, which is like, all right, I guess I'll take that. I'm like, do I get a raise too, or how does that work? So, it just becomes like, it's just we're architecturally responsible for more and more, or at least that responsibility layer is kind of moved from one stack to another. It's layered on the responsibility layer of front ends. Not just the components themselves, which are definitely our concern, but more and more beyond that too. Now let's think about data for a minute. Oh my gosh, there's a lot to think about there too. Even remember all those titles and numbers and authors and stuff that are showing up on CodePen. But you can, of course, I'm not just talking about CodePen. You can imagine how that displaying a website of any kind needs to deal and interface with data. Picture that, look at all that data. I'm sure it's not surprising to you that that data comes from a database. Now, that was definitely a back-end concern at some point in my life. It's like, I can totally get this ready as a front-end designer. I'll build the templates, I'll get it ready for arbitrary data. But at some point, somebody's got to like give me a bucket of data to work with there, and it's definitely not my concern. So, great. When you think of getting data from a database, that's called a query, right? Like, I'm not going to write a query to ask for data from the database. Not my forte necessarily, but somebody can do it, you know. I don't know. I'm the front-end guy. Don't ask me. I don't know. But imagine if I could. Like, it's almost like, imagine if you had a meeting and you're talking about this page and what you need to do. There might be a whiteboard behind you, and you're just like, well, we need like a collection of pens, and we need like the description of it, and then we need like the title and the author and like the URL and like how many hearts it has and stuff. And then you're like, cool. Then you like take a picture of your whiteboard, and then you just like type it out, and that's GraphQL. Like, GraphQL is like, it's like whiteboarded version of the data that you need. And so like, it's an interesting new technology that is kind of like a query language for a database. And it can do much more than that, which we'll get into a little bit. But imagine that it's like, now you're not knocking on Susan's door to have her help you get the data that you need for this new page. You know, there's an API set up for you that you just whiteboard the data, and the data just like arrives for you to use. So it's not just a difference in syntax, it's like a movement of responsibility. Like, no, you do that now. You need that data, you go get it. Which is interesting. So look at this. Just remember, we were talking about that the responsibilities of that little component, which shows an SVG icon, but it shows a number as well. Well, that number has to be queried for at some point. The database has to be asked what number to show. But if you click it, that number 229, assuming you haven't clicked it before and you don't love this item yet, will need to change into the number 230. But not just like on the front end, that number 230 then needs to go back to the database, which at that point I'm like, that's definitely not my job, right? No way. Somebody else has to deal with that, you know, write your Ajax or whatever the hell you're going to do, you know? But in this case, GraphQL deals with that too. In the same way that it's a language for querying things from a database, it's also a language for mutating data and sending it back to a database. So in the same kind of way, I can wrap that component in a mutation component whose whole job in this world is to like take some data and push it back through the GraphQL API to go to the database. And a backend developer set that up. For sure. Like, I'm just the consumer of these APIs, but still, it's become more and more my job. Now I have this component where, like, if you click it, it takes you to some login page if you're not logged in, or if you are logged in, it does some tests or whatever, and ultimately persists that number 230 back to the database. Now that's just a little function that runs, but the mutation action itself looks a lot like GraphQL does. You're still just describing where you want to put that data back into the database. Fascinating. Not just fascinating, like, I like the syntax of it, and I like that you're handing this responsibility to front-end developers in this clean, kind of understandable way, but it's interesting that all these things that used to be somebody else's job have arrived on our doorstep as something that we need to do. It's like, thanks and no thanks, GraphQL, but whatever. This is there was a documentary about GraphQL that was put out, because who knows why, but it's kind of came from Facebook people and is sweeping the nation, so perhaps good timing of it. And Kyle Matthews, the CEO of Gatsby, was in it, and he had there's a nice little moment where he's like a big fan of React and GraphQL, obviously, because Gatsby's like tripled down on these technologies, but I like what he has to say.
To me, GraphQL feels a lot like React. It's just, you know, you look at React, just like a whole class of problems that you had when you're building UIs just disappear. And with GraphQL, a whole class of problems around what is my data and how do I get it in the form that I need it, you know, into the website just disappear. And it really solves a lot of front end problems.
I kind of like, he's not saying that every project has to be a JavaScript project and every project has to use GraphQL, but it's interesting to look at these things like as the front-end phenomenon that they are and be like, why are people picking these things? Well, they're picking things because components architecturally make so much sense to build complex things out of, and it works for teams and all that. And like, at CodePen, watching us move from like a jQuery soup kind of situation into React where things are more componentized and responsibilities are more clear, I can see a lot of value there, and I think the whole industry is to some degree. And then to watch GraphQL come along for the ride too and see the same kind of thing happening for data, it's just worthy of note and interesting to see. The way this manifests itself in a code base is, and this just happens to be React with a Apollo GraphQL setup, but I think Angular has like folders of components with multiple files too. Vue is notable, and then it has single file components that break up these responsibilities. But at CodePen, we often have a folder that represents a component with like an index.js file in it that scaffolds out the component, does boilerplate stuff or whatever, and then kind of like a named template component that does all the semantic HTML and that type of thing. And then the queries are broken out, the mutations are broken out into individual files if they need to be. And then notably, you'll see some CSS sitting right next to it too, in this case Sass, but that's using a technology called CSS modules, which is just a light touch of CSS in JavaScript. It just allows your CSS to sit right next to a component, and what happens is that the class names, both in the CSS and ultimately get applied to the HTML, are like obfuscated. They have some like garbage characters there. And the whole point isn't to make anybody's lives miserable. It's to like avoid conflicts of styling, which is kind of we could do 20 talks about that, but it's been useful to us in a bunch of ways. It also makes naming less of a big deal. See, I don't know, hopefully you can see that okay. The class name that I've applied to this component is just root. Root is a fucking terrible class name. Don't call something root. Root of what? What? Like that's going to be a problem for sure, but in CSS modules, it doesn't matter. It's just a convention. We just call it root because it doesn't end up as root anywhere that matters on the website. It's just saying like the div container of this thing, like I'm just referring to that. And so I don't have to worry about naming. I just write regular old happy little CSS, so we're not leaving anybody out in the cold with weird JavaScript syntax stuff, but it just gets applied to the component in a kind of natural way. Maybe not right for every single project, but it's just the right amount of CSS abstraction for us. So we're talking about like, okay, component-driven design, big deal, cool. Happens to be a front-end thing that maybe used to be more of a back-end thing. It didn't really take hold back-end, but it has now in the world of JavaScript. Everybody loves it. Site-level architecture, more of a front-end thing these days, and dealing with routing, more and more a front-end concern. Fetching our data, talking to APIs, mutating that data and sending it back, dealing with state. All these things that maybe used to be somebody else's job have landed at the front door of front-end developers, which is like, cool, shit, that's a lot, but I'll take it, it's all right. But it's not like that's our job now. It is to some people, but it's our job in addition to all this crap we used to already have to do, which was already a lot of stuff, which is, can you just pull off that design at all? I mean, just knowing enough HTML and CSS and JavaScript to even just make the comp work, that's a job all by itself. And then thinking about that design in a way that you can break it apart into a system and make it happen, that's your job as a front-end developer. Making sure it's accessible, you are the last line of accessibility and the first line, really. Like all of accessibility happens in the way that HTML and CSS JavaScript are implemented in the browser. That's a job to itself. You're worrying about performance. 80% of all performance is the front-end developer's responsibility, and thinking about how all that comes together and how rendering happens and all that. Testing across the browser landscape, testing things across devices, really like worrying about the user and the user experience. Clearly, that's 5 jobs right there, in addition to all the new stuff we just talked about. So holy crap, what a haystack of responsibilities for front-end developers. It's interesting to watch that happen. They're definitely not taking anything away from us responsibility-wise. That haystack of responsibility for front-end developers is just more and more and more. I've used this metaphor before. We're already interesting people in that I think a lot of, in the world of front-end developer, looking at everybody out here, we have these core things that we know together. We all know about divs and spans and buttons and selectors and stuff. We have kind of a tree trunk of knowledge that we all share, but then some of us are illustrators and photographers and accessibility specialists and variable font nerds, and we all have these interesting things that we know, and not only just know about, but bring to work and do. which is fascinating. So all of us are these dots across this tree, and the kind of that Great Divide article was like, cool, we still share some of that tree trunk thing, but there's been like, especially in the last, 4 or 5 years, nerds that have taken the like way back of the front. I want to focus the heck on JavaScript in that world, and people that haven't. So I'm not sure if that metaphor is going to hold up over time. I think ultimately it'll just be more like a spoked tree or something, and that just JavaScript alone won't be the thing that has any kind of divide to us, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Even now, though, as much as what front-end developer, that term hasn't changed that much. Our responsibilities are still, we're browser people, we're hired to do this job for users, and browser, like that stuff hasn't changed that much, but responsibility has. It like, does the word still mean anything?
I think like front-end developer is such a broad term. It's hard to really define like what exactly a front-end developer is, because there's so many different specialties, right? Like you can be a specialist in SVG animations and be a front-end developer and not write any JavaScript at all. Or you could be more working on the data layer like I am and not writing any CSS, for example, and still be considered a front-end developer. So I think it's kind of, as long as you're touching UI or touching something like a data layer that's tangentially related to UI, I think, you can identify as a front-end developer.
So it's weird, there's all kinds of different responsibilities. But as long as they're still like UI-focused, client-focused, user-focused, you're still a front-end developer. So we talked about how a bunch of stuff has moved in a responsibility layer to some way. Not on every website in the world, but we're talking about just generally what's happening in front-end development. If we think of it as a spectrum like this, of back-end to front-end stuff that you need to know, maybe we'd place some of these big topics on that spectrum for like the most back-endy of back-end things, like what operating system your servers are running on, to the most front-endy of front-endy things like HTML. Maybe that's where these things sit, just as a thought exercise. And then we've changed the way that we kind of talk about the core stacks that websites run on. Like here's a classic stack of what websites are built on. I'd say it's old, but it still powers like a massive swath of the internet these days. So it's a modern stack in that regard. LAMP, it's an acronym that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. We even put L in there. Linux, like, who cares? Like, I could care. I've never cared in my history of what operating system my server run on, but whatever, it's in there. So that's what we talk about. And if I'm a front-end developer, this is where I'm at. I'm like way separated from the stack. Like, I don't care what the stack is. I'll just be the front-end guy over here by myself, I guess, whatever. But the way that we talk about websites has changed over time. Here's a little bit more, here's a stack that got into a lot of people's minds and was popular, was Mean, which was Mongo, Express, Angular, Node. And see, we've moved to the right a little bit. We've stopped caring that it runs on Linux. Yeah, it runs on Linux, so does everything, But we've pushed to the right as well, and that we're even talking about frameworks with that stack. And me as a front-end developer, I overlap with that now. So at least I can identify with the stack that we're working on in some regard. Here's another stack that's more and more popular. We'll talk more later about it, but we're keep moving to the right on this spectrum. Serverless, such a big deal these days that is important to front-end development too, and we'll get into that, but it doesn't care about your operating system or even the servers themselves. They're just saying, just write the code and we'll execute it for you. Like I said, we'll talk more and more about that, but it's a little bit more narrow of a stack perhaps, and if I'm a front-end developer, I might almost overlap entirely with that, because a lot of the core of serverless is a lot of times cloud functions or serverless functions, and I might even be writing them based on the JavaScript that I already know, because a lot of back-end stuff on serverless happens to be in Node, which is JavaScript. There's an article by Sean Wang on CSS Tricks that identified the star stack that's been so popular with front-end development these days, which is design systems focused, but TypeScript, Apollo, GraphQL, and React. That's just sweeping the nation, Like, I don't know does it deserve an acronym or not? I don't know, early days for that kind of thing. But it's so front-endy, it even talks about design, which is off the charts front-end development. So me as a front-end developer, I am almost totally overlapped with that. So the way that we talk about the stacks that power our websites has become more about what the front end is built from, more so than the back end, which is interesting to me. So quick stuff about serverless. I think this is a big deal that back-end developers care tremendously about because of the power that's available there, but it's just as relevant or more to front-end developers. At least it is to me, because it's interesting the doors that it opens to me. I made a little website about this, serverless.css-tricks.com, that talks about the services and players involved with all of it. But here's just a little story about it. I wanted to build a site for front-end conferences like this one, just a list of them. So if you're looking at what to go to and what's coming up by date, that's available at CSS Tricks. So I was like, how am I going to build this thing? There's a million ways to build it. In fact, I could have just wrote it in HTML and CSS and put it up there. Like, that's a perfectly fine stack for this website. It's really not that complicated. But I thought, hey, we can do better than that. And like, let's make some modern choices with this thing. And I thought, maybe data-wise, I'm going to just go with Markdown files, because instead of just HTML and CSS, it's nice if I want to like take that date and move it above the title, that I can just change a template file, and that happens across everywhere on the site. Just like front-end developers, we think like, we got to abstract this at least a little bit. We got to at least move the data out and combine it with templates. And where are we going to put that data? Well, there's a million. That's a whole nother talk. Like, do we make a cool little GraphQL API for it, or do we throw it in Firebase, or do we spin up an SQL database? I mean, there's a million places to put this data. But I thought, hey, Markdown files is easy to me. It's familiar. It becomes a little database of itself in a way. It's because there's this wonderful landscape of static site generators. In this case, I chose 11D to do it. It's just a hot one on the block these days that people enjoy. I think it's a really well done one. But it definitely allows me to take this folder full of Markdown files, smash them together into a template to build this site. So the Markdown files kind of are the database in a way. But what's notable, most notable about that, the real reason I chose a folder full of Markdown files is because then they can live in the repo. So this thing is a public repository on GitHub. Most notable reason for that is that I can take pull requests on the content in a way that most CMSs just haven't dealt with public contributions to content in that way. There's like wikis, but I haven't seen a lot of innovation in the wiki space lately, So putting it on GitHub is notable for that reason too. Now I have this, people can just send in conferences and typo fixes and all that kind of stuff, which has been great. And, it makes it open source so people can learn from it or take it or do whatever they want to it. And that if I wanted to, I could just like say, hey, that folder, just put it on GitHub Pages, and now I have basically a Jamstack, pre-built version of the site with hosting for free. That's pretty notable. I didn't do that though. I chucked it on Netlify instead, and Netlify brings a whole suite of beautiful features to the web, which we don't have time to get into, but one of them is like deploy previews, which is really cool. We're going to end up using it for a serverless functions idea we'll look at in a minute. But Netlify also has this feature called Netlify CMS. Doesn't that look like a CMS? There's all these titles and URLs and date pickers and stuff, and I can change this data. The way Netlify CMS works is you install nothing. It's like a single page, it's like a one file app that you just chuck in a folder on your site, and it connects magically through GitHub to pull the files down and like build the CMS. And when I change stuff and edit it, it gets saved as a pull request to the repo. Or if you give it proper access, it'll just commit the dang files and change it, which then runs the static site generator and deploys a new version of the site through Netlify, which is just fascinating. So just because I picked Markdown doesn't mean I don't have a nice CMS to work from, which is really cool. Throw Cloudflare in front of it. I'm sure Netlify doesn't want you to do that, but Cloudflare has its own suite of beautiful security tools and all that. I mention all this because piecing together all these services together feels like the world of serverless to me, and is very valuable, and it's just so easy these days. Like, I can use this even though what do I know about DNS? Nothing. But I get a lot of value from it. So here's a feature that I wanted to add, though, to this site, which would have prevented me going down this Jamstack route, I would have thought. But look, so you're on the site, and you go to a conference, and you're like, I want to remind myself of that thing. So I'm going to type in my email address and hit this arrow button to send it. And so, oh, success, that happens. Now if I go check my email, email has arrived, along with that spam, apparently, that has all the information about this conference. Now, there is no browser API to send an email. It's not a thing that exists. Like, you have to hit a server, and the server has to send that email. And because I'm on GitHub or Netlify or whatever, there is no PHP thing to hit. I can't run a Python script to send that email. Those things don't exist. which is like, oh crap, so maybe I should have went with a more old school stack. Maybe I should have spun up a WordPress site and figured out some plugin to send an email or some crap like that. Well, not necessarily. In fact, you don't need very much code to send an email. You just need like a little tiny bit, especially with third-party services. Here's just one of a million of them, not necessarily an endorsement, but it works. It's called Spark Post, and of course they have APIs in every language on earth. They just want you to hit their API with what email is it going to and what's the body of the email, and they'll send it for you and give you analytics and stuff like that and help with deliverability. It's just a couple of lines of code. It really is like, why do I have to spin up a Heroku thing just to send a friggin' email? Not really, because the world of serverless kind of opens these doors. All these providers, Google Cloud Platform and AWS Lambda and Azure Functions, they want to help you with little stuff like this. They know you only need to run 5 lines of code and keep your API secrets in there so they're not in the browser. They'll just, npm install Spark Post, here's some copy and paste code, throw it in a file, and what's notable about this is you still need to figure out how all that stuff works, which there's a total learning curve to, but a company like Netlify, you just put that right in your project, right next to all the other crap that runs your website. It's in a functions folder, and it deals with that stuff for you. It's just like, oh, I see you have a JavaScript file in your functions file. Just hit this URL, and we'll run that for you. That's a big deal to me. So even me, with I have some JavaScript skill, but not much backend or server skill, I can write that. I can npm install a Spark Post thing and copy and paste the code to send an email in there, and now all of a sudden I'm a little bit of a back-end developer. Not a lot, but I can at least execute code to send an email. That's why, this intersects with the world of front-end development. Yet another responsibility thing that could be chucked on the stack of front-end developers. Wow. I think that's a big deal. So here's the spectrum of knowledge in a way. What's kind of happened, and not on every project in the world, but to some degree it's interesting to watch. Nobody cares about operating systems. I don't even have to care about servers anymore because of serverless stuff. So wipe those away. It's not that databases aren't important. They're tremendously important, but oftentimes these days I'm just interfacing with them via a headless CMS, or because I'm in a flat file situation, or I'm using some database thing that I just interface with it through an API. So I'm not like spinning up a database. I don't really care about the database itself. I just care about APIs. So my spectrum of stuff that I do looks more like that, and like server-side languages, I don't know, it's probably in Node anyway, so I have some comfortability with that, and I can at least contribute there in some way. And APIs and JavaScripts and frameworks and stuff, it's not for everybody, but if I'm a JavaScript-focused front-end developer, that stuff's totally in my wheelhouse. And of course, HTML and CSS, that's me, I'm a front-end developer, so I kind of like, I am the rainbow. I got this thing, which is great. So you look at that, it's like, that's me now. Like, I can do it all. Like, no wonder people are self-identifying more as full-stack developers, because they can bring the whole party to themselves, especially when you consider, I know Git, I can write tests, I'm like a competent designer, I know about build processes, I'm a performance person, I'm an accessibility person, I can set up our deployment pipeline, and everything else on that front end stack. Like, if that's you and you're like, feel like at least a little bit confident in these things and that spectrum, it's like, wow, you're goddamn right, I'm a full stack developer, which is cool. And so I hope that's not worrying to some people. They're like, I don't know all those things. Well, probably most people don't. I don't either. I didn't mean to. Anyway, Amazon's on board too, by the way. I just saw this the other day. They're hiring full stack front enders. Cool. So the haystack, really big. You probably aren't super amazingly great at every single thing that we've talked about today. You're probably just not. Like, even if you kind of know them or are a little bit competent, you'll probably specialize in some of them. It's just inevitable that you just will, and that's good and fine, and hopefully you can Voltron up with people that know other things about you, It leads, though, to situations like this. This is like the best tweet ever that describe this. We're like, when you're full stack, it's like you're, generally you're a little better at the back-end stuff than the CSS-y stuff, which is so great. But what's also cool about this is that at least you're the whole horse, Like, it may not be pretty, but you can do it. You can get around. That front right leg, though, woo! I did a self-portrait of myself, though, that's rather similar. Like, that's me. I'm actually like badass in the front, and then my back-end skills are a little left something to be desired. So I thought, like, what's kind of happening in front-end development, if I wanted to summarize all this, is that really we're like that is kind of like what's starting to happen. We still have like a GIMP wing, kind of, or, you know, that was probably a terrible thing to say, but, you know, like, there's like limits to our full abilities all over the place. Even the horse guts there, like, kind of got erased out a little bit. There's problems with our understanding of the whole stack of things, but it's still kind of beautiful, you know? We're still very powerful. Good stuff happening there. But that's what's cool about what hasn't changed. As much as stuff I talked about that has changed, all these responsibilities that have shown up at our door and interesting possibilities of things that we can do, we're still browser people. When we're hired to do the job, we're still the person who like needs to care about the user and still like make sure the design happens and sweat the UX and be the performance person who cares about the 90 scripts that are being loaded third party on our stupid websites. And dealing with the accessibility, because you're the last line, you know, you are the front and last line of accessibility. You're still all those things. Still all those things. That part hasn't changed at all. So thanks for coming to my talk and listening about front-end developers. I hope you have a wonderful day. What a conference. This is going to be great. CodePen Pro is mandatory for all in attendance. Thank you.